The recording has started. Thank you so much for joining us, the panelists and students who are tuning in. My name is Anina and I'm a second year MDiv student and I work in the alumni office with Karine. So before we start, just a few tips. Change your view to a grid so you can see all the panelists and not just when I'm speaking, for example. And please use the Q&A session, the Q&A function to ask your questions at the end. You can also put them through the panel, and also you can ask in French or in English. Just a quick word on Inspire Students. They're monthly thematic roundtables organized by the Alumni Office, and we want to connect current students and alumni of the Institute around shared interests and share experiences that relate to certain fields. And it's a collaboration with career services, which you know very well, namely Aline and Alizé, who support you with your career needs throughout your time here, and also the Professional Development Committee. And thank you so much for the PDC team and the career services for helping us plan. Our panelist today, which I'm very happy to introduce for the Gender and Diversity Roundtable today, is Sandrine China, who did her MIA in 2011, is the co-founder and CEO of BU Network and Bowie, which is the first incubator dedicated to gender plus projects in Switzerland. The organization and incubator support inclusive ideas and actions that envision a world where gender norms do not define us. She previously consulted for the United Nations Population Fund and was part of the Global Shapers community at the World Economic Forum. She also received the Young Alumna Award in 2019. Then we have Eleanor T Conje, who did her MDiv in 2013. She's a feminist scholar who just completed her PhD in social sciences at the Université de Lausanne, where she wrote her dissertation entitled Neoliberalized Feminism in Nigeria, Developing the Global Entrepreneurial Woman. Her specialties are around women's economic empowerment and gendered experiences in the development and business realm. She is also currently a strategic communications consultant for WIPO and is a principal leadership strategist and coach for ETK Leadership Solutions. And we also have Almas Shaikh, who did the LLM program and graduated in 2019. She's a research associate at the Center for Law and Policy Research, where she works on intersectionality of gender rights and represents gender and sexual minorities and their constitutional guarantees in India through strategic litigation, governance interventions, and policy research. She previously worked at the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, DCAF, and with the United Nations International Law Commission in Geneva. Last but not least, we have Callum Watson, who did the MIA program in 2012. He's a project coordinator in the Gender and Security Division at DCAF, is the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, and he has worked there for 9 years. His current work focuses on facilitating the meaningful participation of uniformed women in UN peace operations. Previously, he has worked in improving the judicial response to domestic violence and teaching gender in the military. And his other specialties include men and masculinities, the inclusion of people of diverse sexual orientations and gender identities, and addressing sexual and gender-based harassment. So as you can see, we have a pretty great panel today. And now I will give the floor to Alizé, who will go through the questions for our panels. Thank you.
Thank you, Zaninka, for this introduction. A big thank you to all the panelists. It's such a pleasure to have you with us today. We have prepared a few questions, and well, the first one is a general question. We are all here to talk about careers in the field of gender and diversity. So my first question for you is, well, why have you decided to work in this field? What do you like the most about it? And what are the biggest challenges for future generations? Well, you might answer related to the current, a bit particular COVID context, but feel free to share any other thoughts. So maybe Sandrine, you would like to be the first to answer this question?
Sure. Thanks, Alizé, and thanks, Zaninka, for the presentation. It's really a pleasure to be with you all tonight, and thanks for hosting this panel. I'm really happy to be here with you. So why I decided to work in this field, I think when I was thinking about this, I realized that I didn't really decide to work for this subject. It's more the subject that chose me. While I was at the University of Geneva, because before my master's at the Institute, I was at the University of Geneva. I studied political science there. And I met a group of people, other students, who wanted to create the first LGBTIQ plus students association in Geneva. And so I joined them with this project. It was the first time that I was doing something entrepreneurial like this. And I quickly realized that I had truly a passion for it, for developing the organization, for the topic, for finding other members and creating an impact that I could really see, I could really feel. And I also learned a lot doing it. And of course, being gay myself, it felt great to be able to have an impact on my community, to impact something that was really close to me and try to improve the reality of the future generations as well. So maybe they don't have to go through all the things that the generations before me and myself, we have been through, and maybe the future is not so complicated for them. And that was really important for me. So maybe that was my decision based on a personal experience. And yeah, and I think what I like the most about it, working in gender, is that gender is not a field, it's transversal to all topics. Mm-hmm. So gender has an impact in all fields. If you think at education, the workplace, leisure, TV, tech, etc., like gender can have an impact in all of these fields. And it means that if you work on gender, you will or you can work and have an impact on all these different topics and all these different industries. And so me as an entrepreneur in this field, I had the opportunity to create over the past 10 years many projects in really many different fields. And that was something that I loved. We had the opportunity, for example, to build like trainings for youth workers in Switzerland to be more inclusive of gender, trainings for companies, which is already another side completely, because you have the business side as well, a technology platform for recruitment, a YouTube campaign with politicians. Recently, we launched an incubator, like a startup incubator, and we are now working on an online marketplace to connect creators worldwide who are disrupting and influencing gender in the music industry, in the fashion industry, etc. So that's really diverse, and I think it's never boring, and for me it's very creative as well, on top of having an impact, of course. And the last part here of the question was about the biggest challenges. For me, I think there are still many things to be done when it comes to equality and inclusion of all, because gender norms still really impact how we define ourselves, how we dare to express our gender identity, specifically when it's not according to the norms, how we sometimes limit ourselves when we love someone of the same gender, or what we can just dream of, or the opportunities that we get if we're a woman, if we're part of the LGBTIQ plus community, for example. And I'm not even talking of the intersectional dimensions that can be even make your life even more difficult. And so for me, I think that today we still have many things to do, and at the same time the generations are changing, and the new generations, when we look at Generation Z, for example, the generation after us, we say that there was a recent study last year in the US, and it showed that half of that generation was not identifying as strictly heterosexual. So, which means this will have a tremendous impact on how those people live their lives and how they interact with others. And I think that's something really important, and we see this globally, like this movement for more equality and for more diversity and for accepting people as they are and not needing to put them in boxes. And maybe last about COVID, I think what COVID has shown us is that the world is interconnected, and also the importance of this interconnection. And I think that after COVID, we will never take for granted the power of seeing our friends, of being able to support people, of being able to share a hug with someone. And also we've realized like the power of community that is so important for so many people, so many isolated women or LGBTIQ plus people, specifically when you're in lockdown and you're in a safe environment. If we think of sexual or domestic violence or violence against queer youth, for example, in their family setting. And I think we really need to act on that, but at the same time, like, for example, going virtual, going digital with the incubator, it enabled us to connect with entrepreneurs in so many different countries around the globe that we wouldn't have the opportunity otherwise. And so we could really see that it is up to us to redefine borders, and that we can really create a global movement for change. And it gives me a lot of hope.
Yes, thank you, Sandrine, and thank you for finishing on a very positive and hopeful note. I think this is really important in light with the current context. And thank you for such a complete answer. Maybe, Eleanor, you would like to share your experience or comment on what Sandrine has said. I don't know if you wish me to repeat the question, let me know.
Well, thank you so much, Zaninka, and thank you, Elise, for hosting this and for your question. I think Sandrine's answer was just amazing, especially in light of the changing global context in which we find ourselves and the challenges thereof. And it's amazing, as she was talking, I was like, my goodness, it's one of the things I love about working in gender, Sandrine, like you talked about, you said, you know, when you are working in gender, it means that you are actually a part of so many different other communities. You're part of the technology industry, you're part of the communications, the creatives industries. And a lot of these industries actually need people who are conscious and who are sensitive to the issues of gender to be a part of the conversation and to highlight issues that they might not necessarily always see. Now, I am one of those feminists who really defines herself in so many ways as still working, unfortunately, under like the Women in Development framework, only because of the context of the people that I work with. What do I mean by that? I talk a lot about women in the work that I do, not because women are synonymous with gender. We know that that's not the case, right? But because I work in particular with women in the developing world. Therefore, in so many ways, as much as we're having very progressive conversations here in Europe, in the US where I grew up as well, I see that in so many ways, for example, on the African continent where a lot of my research was based, the conversation is still very much about rights. I mean, we're still having a conversation that's rooted so much from things that I wish that we no longer had to talk about. So in that light, when I talk about gender, when I talk about the gendered experiences of people, my work specifically focuses on women. And to go back to the larger question of why I found myself involved in this, Sandrine, like you, it's also a very personal reason. I think for a lot of people who work in gender, there always tends to be a very personal element. Growing up with my family, I grew up with, parents who are absolutely amazing, but who are very traditional in a lot of ways. So, well, they used to be. Now I think they're a little bit more progressive because I'm part of that family and I'm an adult now. So I have comments. I got something to say. But growing up, they were very traditional. My mom was all about roles. You got to learn how to cook. You got to learn how to do that. And I was just not having it. I was like, that is not what I'm interested in at all. But no one else was having that conversation with me. I felt like everyone else accepted so much of what society was telling them that a girl is supposed to be like. So for me, it was this notion in my head of, but I don't like doing that. Why do I have to do it just simply because I'm a girl? And I remember I was 15 or 16 years old. And from then on, I really became passionate about feminist politics. I went to university, started studying feminist theories, and then ended up at the Graduate Institute, kind of going along in the same light. And I've been an activist since I can remember, precisely because of the personal experiences that I had and wanting to create spaces where girls, again, my focus is on women and girls, where girls can be who they are without necessarily having to conform to gender roles that prescribe them to certain parts of society or certain jobs or certain dreams, because we all want to live who we are. Like Sandrine, you were saying, we all want to live who we are. We don't want to conform to a certain mold of who society says we're supposed to be. So that is the reason why I started working on gender issues. And it's something that the deeper that I've gone into the field, the more passionate I've become about it. And that led me precisely to pursuing my PhD and continuing to work specifically with African women. Then it's very important for me to highlight that point, because it's probably one of the elements that I love the most. It's bringing the voices of women who look like me to the forefront, whose experiences sometimes are translated in ways that don't actually reflect what they live. And that's something that really became very tangible for me, finishing the master's and going into the PhD experience, seeing the myriad of ways in which women experience their lives, and also seeing how far we've come with feminist politics, but how far we still have to go, and looking at the difference between the theories that we talk about and the reality of people's lived experiences. So kind of being a translator between those two worlds, somebody who loves theory, but at the same time, who wants to translate and make impact, and who wants to see people's way of living actually transform before their own eyes. So in a context of COVID, to round it up, I find it, like Sandrine was saying, that it's incredible, because in so many ways, our ability to be able to do things using technology has opened up the space for us to have more and more conversations. But even in that, there's still spaces whereby a lot of, for example, if you look at rates on gender-based violence in a pandemic context, those numbers have gone up very, very high. So there's a lot of challenges. There's new ways to kind of analyze and look at the ways that women experience their lives in light of COVID-19 and the pandemic that we're all in. But it's honestly, I'm optimistic, like Sandrine, I'm extremely optimistic. I'm happy that through the work that I've been doing on the field and with the women that I continue to work with, I see the tangible difference that we can still make, but still hope that we can do so much more, because there is a need to continue to critique, continue to dismantle norms, continue to open up more spaces where women, men, people in the LGBTQI community plus can continue to express and walk in the fullest capacity of who they are.
Wow, thank you, Eleanor. So much passion is felt when you speak. We also felt it with Sandrine, and I think that that's really great. Also that you are both talking about the fact that it was in you, and this choice came to you, Sandrine, you said, and it's also something that we repeat to students when they ask us, well, what should I do? What is the right path for me? The career is not something external. It's really something that starts with yourself and with an introspection about what are your values, who you are, and what actually stimulates you, motivates you, excites you, and gives this drive and this passion that we really felt in both of you. So thank you. Almas, we would like to hear also about you. So the why this field, and what do you like about it, and maybe the challenges as well.
Sure. First of all, thanks everyone for making this possible and making me come to this and share the platform with all of these other alumni who have done such amazing work in the field of gender and diversity. From what Sandrine and Eleanor said, the issues that we take up are usually inspired from our own personal experiences, and it's the same for me, because I come from India, and in India, when you talk about the differences, diversity is one of the main issues, or one of the main areas that you see. And when I say diversity, I'm not talking about gender diversity. I'm also talking, or LGBTQI diversity. I'm also talking about in terms of your access to basic rights, like food, like water, like shelter. So your position in the social stratification, whether you're from an upper class or lower class, makes a lot of difference in terms of how you access these rights. And these intersectional approaches, whether you are from a rich family or you're from a poor family, whether you're from an open family or whether you're from a closed-off family, whether you're from an extremely religiously closed-minded family, which in turn affects whether you're experiencing and exploring your sexuality and your gender all of these are interconnected, and these intersectional issues are very much something that I have seen growing up, and that was something that I was always interested in. Which is why even in my master's, I was doing the LLM in protection of vulnerable groups. Specifically, when I was going through that, I realized that there are issues which need to be taken up on an intersectional basis. When we talk about diversity, we're talking about LGBTQI representation, but we're also within that representation, we're talking about representation of the LGBTQI people in different stratifications. What if there are disabled LGBTQI voices that need to be heard? What if there are poor LGBTQI voices that need to be heard? And in such, that essentially led me to the work that I'm doing right now, which is mostly in terms of three areas that I work on, which is to make sure that there is research on these intersectional issues, to sort of participate and lead governance interventions in issues of LGBTQI and diversity and intersections. And lastly, to see and learn from our research and use that in amplifying the voices of the marginalized communities through access to courts, through strategic impact litigations, and by representing clients in every forum that is available to make sure that the rights that are guaranteed to them are actually given to them and translated into practical reality. And that is exactly why I'm working on gender and diversity in my current role, because it allows me to do all of these in three different areas, in both research, to make sure that that research is sort of brought forward to consultations and governments, and to make sure that whatever plans have been taken up by the government and the consultations are again reinforced in the judiciary so that the people can get right. So it's like a threefold step, which is what I'm doing. And I really like the fact that whatever I have learned on international level in terms of what I did in my master's, I'm able to sort of see its implementation at the most local level. So it is a complete zooming in of the international principles that I have studied and I have sort of learned growing up in my law school or in my master's, and sort of zooming into small regions and small local authorities in South India and making sure that that is available to gender and sexual minorities in every way possible. And when I say every way possible, I mean specifically, and I'm because I'm a lawyer, I might go into the specifics of it. I mean, in terms of making sure that the rights that have been accrued to them in terms of marriage, in terms of employment, in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, all of this is guaranteed at the most basic level, because only when this is guaranteed can we ensure that everybody will go on to more lofty goals. Nobody was going to talk about my true passion or my true love when they can't talk about my next meal, you know. So these are which is why I love working on this, because I can see the immediate impact that the work has on gender and diversity and how it can immediately impact the people around you. And that is one of the reasons why I like working on this the most. But coming into how COVID-19 has sort of made it all virtual, I agree with Sandrine in knowing that, you know, it has brought into light the fact that we want more connections, even if it is virtual, but it is also bringing into light, like Eleanor said, the increase in gender-based violence. And although there's an increase in gender-based violence and domestic violence, specifically in India, there is also a report which I was working on, which shows that even this gender-based violence is underreported in terms of LGBTQI communities. And within that, specifically, the transgender communities, who are, because they're shunned by the society, they usually do not have access to any of these rights that I was talking about. And that is a harsh reality that we have been faced with during COVID-19. And the issues of access to basic amenities like food, water, shelter, even though there are constitutional guarantees for the same, it is sort of disheartening to see that the governance mechanisms and to see the gaps within these governance mechanisms and see how they can be improved. And that is the sort of work that I have sort of been doing during COVID-19. And that brings me to my next point, that is, what should future generations do? I feel that there are enough rights there are laws, there are research that is made, but there is a gap between that law, that research, that policy being implemented at the local levels to make sure that the rights that we're talking about in the UN General Assembly or in international conferences are translated into reality for the people at the ground level. And that is what I've been seeing. And through the work that I've done, I'm quite hopeful that it is being done at a very vociferous speed by all the people who are, working on gender and diversity, and that I feel the future generations should just continue that work and put in more effort, and that way we can translate whatever we are talking about in terms of gender and diversity into reality, not only at the international level but at the local levels. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for making this great connection in describing a bit your approach to research and how you translate it into reality. We'll get back to that in the other questions, since you are also a researcher, but it's very interesting to know a bit more about this aspect of your research and how it's important that there is an impact, and it is also what drives your work. Thank you, Almas. And finally, Callum, can we hear also your thoughts about your career so far, challenges, and the decision, what drove your decision, motivations? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Elise. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody, and thanks for organizing this panel. So yeah, I've got the challenge now of coming after three very distinguished speakers. I think ultimately the thing that drove me to this career in the first place was a sense that I wanted to work in an area where I did feel like I was making a difference. I think that when I was studying a lot of the subjects in the MIA course, you focus a lot on kind of state security, and you have this very kind of state-centric perspective when it comes to international relations. And I think when I began to discover gender studies and feminism, you began to question whether this is in a way actually a gendered way to see the world, and a way that kind of biases some of the concerns that tend to affect the kind of dominant white men in the world more than those that affect everybody on a kind of more individual basis. So I think I kind of came to the conclusion where I did see gender equality as being one of the root causes of suffering, one of the root causes of insecurity in the world, and something that we need to address more at an individual level. But I think, like what Sandrine said, it's so fascinating because it cross-cuts all the different areas, and you can work on it, at a very kind of grassroots level that Almas talked about. There's the Women, Peace and Security agenda, or increasingly in the Human Rights Council, they're looking at the sexual orientation and gender identity agenda. So there's all these different levels in which you could engage. And I think it's just interesting to see how these different things link together. In terms of what I like about it most, I think it's something where you never stop learning. I think coming in here, I've learned a lot about what it means to be a man. I think that's something that not everybody thinks about at the very beginning. I think women are often pushed to think about their gender, but to discover that men actually have a gender, to realize that there are instances where I get privilege from this gender, but there's also a cost to that privilege, which comes from conformity. So being a gay man as well, there are some limitations to that, but I'm also a white gay man, so that gives me some advantages. I think these continuous conversations that you have with people mean that you're also learning at the same time that you're giving generally people analytical tools to try and understand their situation. And even if I'm working with the armed forces, quite frequently people realize that what we've been talking about has an impact on their personal life as well. And you get to sometimes see that kind of aha moment of, someone in a man in the Finnish armed forces who suddenly realizes that, wait a minute, gender affects his life, and the way that he behaves towards his children will affect how they feel growing up as well. So I think you do see these small changes, and that's something that's really quite motivating moving forward. I think also it's been interesting to explore some of the big, I guess, kind of social media trends, such as the Me Too campaign, or looking at Black Lives Matter. I think working in this field, again, it's not just about kind of protecting the vulnerable. You also realize how your behavior as someone who sometimes has privilege and sometimes doesn't have privilege can affect others. And so that can be quite difficult in terms of reflection sometimes, but it can also be quite empowering. And I think also, like many of Almas and Eleanor in particular have said, you also realize that you're in a position sometimes, in your position of privilege, to raise the voices and to express things that perhaps other people have been saying for years, but nobody else is listening to. So I find this dynamic of, working between the personal and the international to be really interesting and really quite stimulating. When it comes to challenges for future generations, I think something that will be a challenge is that after COVID, I think a large amount of government spending has gone into COVID response. That money has to come from somewhere, and there's a prediction that particularly at the UN level, there'll be a huge funding shortage in 2022. So there might be a reduction in the number of kind of jobs that are officially labeled as gender, or the traditional jobs that people might have thought about when they first started working in the area of international affairs. Another thing is that I feel that we were on a forward path when it came to gender equality and LGBT rights for a long time. And suddenly then, we got Trump elected. We have the rise of China, where this is not really a priority in the same way. We have Poland, a European Union member, effectively banning abortion and creating LGBT-free zones. I think perhaps there was a bit of naivety in the past that gender was this kind of nice, soft issue on the side. And I think there's an increasing recognition that gender is inherently political. We're talking about big stakes here. When I was working in Ukraine, there's a war of ideas happening. And the war is essentially, there are groups of Ukrainians who want to follow the kinds of values when it comes to gender equality that espouse women's rights and LGBTI freedoms. But there's also a whole media war happening with those that are sidelining with the Russian government, where they're also running, gender events that talk about how, there's a biological reason why women need to be in the house, or how, LGBTI people is some kind of response to overpopulation. There's a kind of whole war of ideas going on. So I think it's got a lot more political than we thought about before. I think the one thing that is both challenging and fascinating about this field then is that it's a field that will always evolve. It's not like you can take the ideas that, I was perhaps studying in 2010 to 2012 at the Graduate Institute and still apply them. There will always be work to do when it comes to gender and diversity. There will always be a need for people to work on these topics, but the way in which you do it will be changing throughout time. And something that I think becomes a bit frustrating when you come out of the student life and you work in the practitioner life is you realize that you don't have as much time to spend actually studying and learning about these topics in an academic sense that you did in the past. But that's why you actually rely on, you have interns or your young staff coming in to teach you new things, to teach you the things that they've been learning about, that they've been seeing on social media. So, the only way that we're going to address some of the bigger challenges when it comes to gender and diversity in the future is to have people with fresh blood and bold new ideas coming into the field. So, there's definitely a place for the kinds of students that go to the Graduate Institute in that framework. Thanks.
Thank you, Callum. And yes, students, the world needs you. And thanks, Callum, for making the link as well with current topics that happened recently. I think it's really good to put it in perspective into some practical aspects as well. All right, so I'll move on with some more specific questions to each of you regarding your specific career. I'm just looking at the time, as we do want to keep some time for the students to also ask you some questions. Maybe we can try to keep the answers concise, so we finish around 5:07, and we have 10 more minutes for the Q&A. But this introduction was great, and thanks to all of you for your inspiring talks. If I were studying, I would feel your energy and the drive to actually also join you and do something about it. So that's amazing. Thank you. So I have a question for Sandrine. Sandrine, you are an entrepreneur with 2 ventures and a successful one. You received many awards and part of the Global Shapers as well. So can you share with students something about your choice of becoming an entrepreneur, and how did you get there? Did you do it right after graduation, or did you do a transition and do an internship or work before?
Yeah, so I'll try to be brief. Actually, I came to study in Geneva because I grew up in Switzerland, but in another canton. And so I came to Geneva because for me, my dream was to work at the UN, to have a career at the UN. I wanted to change the world, and for me, it was the way to change the world. And so between my bachelor in political science at the University of Geneva and my master's at the Institute, I took a gap year and I applied to many UN agencies to do an internship there. And so I landed an internship at UNFPA, so the Population Fund, and I was really happy because I got the internship in the gender department. And then after my internship, I briefly worked there as a consultant as well to finish my gap year. And so for me, the experience there was really great in the sense that I was where I wanted to be, not in a big position. I was an intern, but still I was experiencing what I wanted to experience. But at the same time, I felt that something was missing for me because, as Callum said, there are different levels where you can have an impact. And for me, I really understood that I need to be like in the field, like at the grassroots level. And I felt that what I was experiencing with my students' association was actually more motivating me more than the current internship I was doing. But the thing was that for me, like a students' organization or an organization, an association was not really a legit career path. And when I discussed it with my mom, she said, but you didn't do all these studies to just have a small organization. Like for her, entrepreneurship was not a career, and for me either. I didn't know that it could be really something relevant, that it could be a job. And so it took me a little bit of time to just keep pushing with the project and meet other people, other entrepreneurs and other organizations supporting entrepreneurs who just told me, actually, it's not a side project. It's not something small that you're doing. Actually, you're a social entrepreneur, and that's something. And for me, it just gave me like the legitimacy to do what I was doing.
Thank you, Sandrine. And let me say, entrepreneurship is a topic that is very, very close to my heart as well, for the reason of being down to the grassroots level and really contributing down there, have the impact right in front of you. And the Career Services is advocating a lot and pushing to show students that, yes, you can be an entrepreneur. It's also a career path, and you have the world is your oyster, and sometimes we see students having beautiful experiences. They build things, but they don't even value them on their CV because it was not paid. So I think that's really great what you shared, and I'm sure a lot of students can relate to it. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Next question, back to you, Eleanor. So can you tell us, well, we receive a lot of questions from PhD students about the transition from PhD research to actually the more practical work life. So can you maybe share with them how you managed to make a good transition between the research and the professional world? And also how your thesis relates to your current job, if there is any relationship?
Wow, what a great question. I get this question a lot from people that I mentor and different platforms that I speak at as well. Now, I have a very unique experience in terms of finishing my PhD and also building my career. So one of the things that I was fortunate enough to do was actually continue to work throughout my PhD experience. So I did which is not necessarily something that I'll always advocate for, because it's like having two full-time jobs. So one of the things that I did is throughout my 4.5 years of my PhD, I was actually working. I worked with the private sector, and then from there, I started working with the UN and continued that realm, and then started my business 2 years before I finished the PhD, and just kind of transitioned from the PhD to doing the things that I do now. Now, for a lot of people, so it's not a very traditional answer, because a lot of people do tend to finish their research and then begin and choose a career path, sometimes in academia, sometimes in the world of practice, and sometimes people like myself who kind of want to bring those two worlds together. So one of the things that I always give as a piece of advice is a lot of it is really determining what you want to do with your PhD. if you want to be, if you want to be engaged in academia and you know that you want to teach at a university, for example, then of course that is the path that you need to take. You need to begin to publish from the time that you're working on your PhD. That way, by the time that you're done, you're actually marketable to universities. Now, if you want to work with the UN and you want to transition into doing something in the practice, in the world of practice, for example, then in so many ways you have to really get creative, because the challenge that a lot of other friends of mine have when they finish their PhD and have only focused on the PhD and now are looking for jobs within the UN or within NGOs or in the private sector, whatever, is precisely that they're now competing with people who have had several years of experience, and what they have to their name is their PhD. The PhD is great, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, there's always a question of what do you really bring to the table in terms of your ability to strategize and come up with solutions in a very practical level. So it becomes a challenge for a lot of PhD students who've never really been out there, who've never interned, who've never really done anything tangible to actually then get a job within those sectors. So one of the things that I say is where you can consult, write papers, policy-related papers, things that show that you can actually really do things in practice. You might not have the time to actually get a job or have the time to do an internship or whatever, but you can still use what you're doing in your research to write papers for international organizations, for think tanks that are very practical in approach. That way, by the time that you finish, not only do you have a great and strong academic profile, but in some ways you also have things in the world of practice that make you, I hate to use this neoliberal term, marketable. But that's exactly what it is. Now, what I do is related to what I studied and what I did for my PhD is related to the work that I do now. I do a lot of things. I am in so many ways a social entrepreneur. I'm a serial entrepreneur, if you can put it like that. So I continue to work with the UN and consult, but then I also have about 2 or 3 enterprises that I run. And one of them is a really social entrepreneurship leadership initiative where I work directly with African women specifically, and then also women in the diaspora coming from the African continent or minority communities on leadership training specifically. So in so many ways, the work that I did in Nigeria, which was on looking at how public-private partnerships for gender equality impact the experiences of women, I found a lot of space in there where the critical element of feminist politics was forgotten. It was so much about making women more productive, making women better at making money for themselves and making money for the private sector, without necessarily the critical address of gender equality and how so many women are left out in those spaces in a very critical way. So what I did is I developed a space that allows me to critically engage, but at the same time still enables me to give women the tools necessary to be able to build lives for themselves, whether as entrepreneurs or as women working in leadership within international organizations.
Great, Eleanor, thank you so much. Great tips that I will for sure share with the students. And it's true that being a consultant can be related to your PhD. And actually, if your PhD can build the ground for then your strategic consultancy related work. And it's a very smart way to link the two. Thank you so much for your answer. So next question is for Almas. So Almas, you graduated last year in 2019. So can you share with the students, well, how was it easy to find a job right after graduation? And did you do anything specific during your time at the Institute to help the transition after your graduation?
Sure, thanks for that question. And it's bringing back all of these memories I have of Geneva and spending my time there. So what I did as part of being at the Institute was try and look for internships which sort of aligned with my interests in public law and rule of law and human rights. And thankfully, I got an internship at DCAF. I don't know if Callum remembers, but I remember meeting Callum on my first day, and he and one other person from DCAF came and said, "Hey, we have this team, and if you have any problems, you can approach us." And I still remember that being like, "Oh, this is such a nice place to work at, and it's such nice people." So I did work at DCAF in the Asia Pacific unit, where I was specifically mapping countries in South Asia and seeing what their responses to rule of law, democracy, and human rights was. And I believe that was an important step in terms of the international approach that I was giving to human rights and how it is seen in terms of organizations like DCAF and how areas of rule of law or human rights are seen from a Western perspective, and what are the issues that are needed to understand how to tackle the drawbacks in the systems that are in place. So I believe that was one of the most important internships that I've had, and that also furthered my approaches and even my answers, now that I remember, in my exams and in my and even in my understanding of the meaning of rule of law. And after that, I did work with the International Law Commission right after under Professor Reinisch, and that was a very lucrative opportunity in terms of knowing how law works at the topmost level, and which meant that I was part of the group that was making laws which would or making principles or drafting texts which would later be laws applicable to everyone and to all states who are part of the UN. So that was an amazing experience. After that, it wasn't difficult for me to get a job, but what I did find difficult was to sort of streamline all of my varied interests within human rights to what I did definitely need to work on, which was I realized that I wanted to apply everything that I've learned at the grassroots level to see what is actually happening and what the reality is. And once I figured that out, it was quite easy to go into the policy space in India and work with Center for Law and Policy Research, where I'm still working now. So it wasn't difficult as long as you already know where it is that you want to go. Until then, it was a fun experience to actually just network and see what's happening and what's out there in the world of human rights, and what would catch your interest. Even within diversity, there are so many issues. So yeah, that was my experience.
Thank you, Alma. It's very interesting, and we keep telling the students as well to explore. So your internship at DCAF helped you validate some of the thoughts that you had about working in this field, and it inspired you in some ways. So yeah, it is important to explore. And during those master's years, 2 years in Geneva, there is much time for the exploration. So thanks, thanks for being aligned with the tips that we share with the students. It's good to see a real example of that. Okay, last question is for Callum. So Callum, well, you currently work at DCAF and you've been working there for many years now, and DCAF is right next door to the Institute. So my question to you is, do you think studying at the Institute with such proximity to the International Geneva has helped you achieve your career objective and be where you are? And well, any tips for the students that you would like to share is welcome.
Thank you very much, Elise. Okay, so I will say that while I was a student at the Graduate Institute, I did work part-time at DCAF, but that contract actually came to the end while I was, when I graduated, and then I changed into the gender division. So they're not completely aligned. I also want to situate myself a little bit and acknowledge that I have a bit of privilege here, right? Because I was a European citizen at the time. It's actually very difficult, DCAF being a Swiss organization, for non-European people to get entry-level jobs. Basically, it's almost impossible for DCAF to justify that, because it's very hard to show that someone at the entry level has different skills, that are not found in other people. So as a European, yes, absolutely, it did help to have a bit of work experience working at DCAF. However, I would actually argue that being in Geneva in terms of being positive for my career came from some different things. I felt that it helped me to better understand a lot of the issues that were going on around the world, not because I would be networking with people with the explicit purpose of trying to get a job. So people do sometimes call me up and they say, oh, I want to hear about your work. that's not really that exciting to me, to be quite honest. But at the time while I was there, I was writing my thesis on men and masculinities. So I was looking, I did a gender analysis of the Cuban Missile Crisis, looking at an all-male meeting room to see whether we could use gender tools to understand what was going on in that particular area. And I called up Madeleine Rees, who's the head of Women's National League for Peace and Freedom, and said, hey, I really want to make sure this is actually useful to understanding the masculine dynamics of conflict. Would you like to have coffee and talk about it? And she said, yes. I mean, you know, people would absolutely love to have conversations about the kinds of things that people do research on at the Graduate Institute. And like I said before, we don't have as many opportunities to learn about new and emerging trends. So when we can have these kind of geek conversations with students, I think that's when, first of all, you can understand how you can make some of the papers that you write that Eleanor mentioned before a bit more relevant. And that's how you can engage a bit more in some of the international trends that happen when it comes to gender equality and diversity. So I think that's what the opportunity is in Geneva. With that in mind, I eventually began to not take any courses that were examined by exam. And I only took courses that were assessed by essays, because it gave me this kind of opportunity to try and explore some of the issues and write papers that would ultimately become A, useful in applying for jobs, but B, actually, I still use the understanding terrorism syllabus that I had from the Graduate Institute in the current work that I'm doing today. I think it's also just important to recognize that Geneva is a very diverse city, so it does have an LGBTI movement. So you can meet a whole lot of people and really understand what's happening in global LGBTI rights if you get involved in, for example, organizing Pride, which should be happening again next year. I actually, by chance, did the same yoga class as two of my future supervisors. So there's also kind of informal ways to get to meet people. But I think, and one of the best things we did as well in the Graduate Institute was, I think this was Professor Elizabeth Prugel organized a workshop whereby students presented their research, and you got a commentary then from both an academic and a practitioner in the field. So again, it was engaging on the topic rather than trying to meet people for the sake of meeting people. That was really quite useful. So I think it's sometimes important to get out of the student bubble at Geneva, to try and, meet people doing things you're passionate about. There's a whole bunch of people working with refugees in Geneva. There's an interesting initiative right now happening in Switzerland looking at multinationals and trying to promote corporate social responsibility. So this is a way, first of all, of finding your passion. And then I think also that's a way to tailor the work that you're doing in research to make it relevant, to give you the kind of analytical skills and the content level skills that will become useful in applying for jobs later on, be that in Geneva itself or in other places around the world.
Thanks, Callum. And I think it also demystifies a little bit what networking is about. It's not just going to events, but it's actually people you meet anywhere and just connecting and building trust with these individuals. So that's a great example. And let me just say something, because you mentioned that there is a big barrier for non-EU to get an entry-level job. Yes. However, during your time at the Institute, you can intern as a non-European without the need for a permit. So don't be disappointed. Even if it's maybe more difficult to get an entry-level job, you can use your time to actually do an internship in any type of organization. So just wanted to add this, and I'll finish there for the questions and leave the floor to Karine now, if we have some questions from the students. Thank you so much for your great answers and participation.
Yes, I have here two questions for Callum, but you answered a bit already, but still. The first one is coming from Aravind Ganapat, sorry for the pronunciation. So do you think experience in the field at some point is important to have a career in gender and diversity? And the second one is, through 8 years of work experience, what are the trends you have observed in the field of gender and security? Has there been significant progress being made?
Okay, you want me to take any other questions on the table? Yeah, okay, I'll take these two questions. Okay, all right, field experience. All right, this is, like I said, we're kind of dealing with a patriarchal world, and yeah, So, okay, I would say right now I have a challenge in that I have worked in other countries. I've worked in Japan, so that's not recognized as field experience. At one point, I had a project where I was going to Bosnia for a week every month. And unlike when you work for the UN, I'm not picked up by the airport by some convoy. When I go there, I actually, have to call the Bosnian taxi driver. I studied a bit of Bosnian, and I was working physically with an NGO, so I wasn't in, some kind of international office. But that isn't recognized a lot of the time when it comes to applying for UN jobs. So I do think that, unfortunately, we're still in a world where having a set numbers of field experience, and the field, I'm sure Eleanor will tell you, is a very problematic word in general, is still sometimes seen as a prerequisite. I think one of the challenges is that there's a lot of screening going on when you apply for job applications. So it may not necessarily be the person who employs you at the end who makes the first cut. So I think for me, yes, it does limit my career options to a certain extent that I don't have field experience in the kind of classical sense. But we were having quite an interesting conversation with people who work for the European Common Security and Defence Policy about the fact that it's ironic that, if you work on security sector reform as a police officer, they'll look at your 3 years of field experience working in Nairobi where you didn't really leave your office, but they won't consider somebody who worked on helping refugees to integrate in Sweden. That isn't field experience. So I hope things begin to change, but I don't want to be naive and say that actually it doesn't count. There were quite a few people who, after finishing at the Graduate Institute, went to places like Tunisia and Afghanistan, and that's really helped them in their career ultimately. I also think that, to an extent, having the language expertise, so learning Arabic or learning some of the other languages in demand is really something that's quite important, even though, I do see this definition of distinction between field and headquarters problematic. Trends in terms of whether things are getting better. I think people say that you can only really analyze impact kind of 3 to 5 years after your project. I think for this reason, even though I'm working in a field where I want to make a difference, I think primarily it's also important to work in a field where you enjoy what you do, and you get some kind of personal satisfaction from it, because you won't know whether it's effective until later on. Something I do find interesting when we look at things like the Women, Peace and Security Agenda 1325 is you can critique this agenda as much as you like, but what it's done is it's given a common language to people around the world. So, we've had projects where we've worked in rural parts of Senegal, and they're speaking the same language as, people who, as lawmakers, perhaps in Washington, D.C. So I do see increased levels of engagement. I do see an increased understanding of, LGBT rights. So I do see steps going forward. But I think there's a great quote that says the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. So there'll always be this thing where you think you make two steps forward, and then you have to kind of backtrack, and you realize things have been moving in 2 different directions. So I think I have seen progress. I think that we're able to have conversations about gender that we weren't able to have before. When it came to DCAF, we didn't have a nursing room. We didn't have a gender equality policy, and the rules and regulations couldn't mention the word homophobia. And I've just been in a workshop as a person of trust, that's what Almas was referring to, where I've talked about all of those 3 things. So both, I think, in kind of my everyday environment and also in the international level, I do think there's been movement forward, but there's always that kind of back and forth that you have to be aware of.
Thank you so much, Callum, for your answer. Well, we are really close to the end, so maybe a last question to Eleanor, which is a bit in the same sense than what we discussed with Callum right now. Eleanor, in your communications consultant position, how do you see people perceive the issue on gender and diversity?
That's a very interesting question. That's a very, very interesting question. Okay, I'm going to keep it very, very short since we're almost out of time. Now, I'm going to answer it in 2 ways, right? And the work that I do with WIPO, for example, with WIPO, I can tell you that there's still a lot of progress that needs to be made in terms of people understanding that gender is not just a question about women. Like I earlier said, I specifically use the term women precisely because that's the group of people that I work with. But you see that in so many ways, international organizations are still having challenges understanding what we conceptualize and what we mean by gender. Therefore, in that light, there's always somebody like me who's always continuously highlighting and pointing out to the fact that gender is not synonymous with women or synonymous with men. It's about the socially constructed norms that determine what a man is supposed to be, what a woman is supposed to be, and how we problematize that in the work that we do. So I'll answer that question in that light. Now, in the work that I do as a leadership and communication strategist, I can tell you that in so many ways, again, as related to WIPO, there's still so much progress that has to be made. And in that particular area, especially when we talk about it from the sense of diversity, is the lack of accessibility that women in positions of power still have within UN organizations. So a lot of the work that I do in my communications and leadership trainings is I work with senior level women. And in those conversations, we see a lot of the exclusivity that's still there. Here in Geneva, where a lot of women, because it is a patriarchal word, like Callum said, a lot of women are not able to access certain types of spaces, even though they have the same number of experiences. So in so many ways, I go back to what I was saying earlier, that I see that there's so much progress that we're making in critical ways, which I'm super happy to see. But at the same time, there's still so many old habits that are just not dying. And there's still so much exclusion. And then when we bring it down to Black women, that forget it's a completely different conversation. Black women who are gay, forget that they don't even exist. So in so many ways, there's still a need for questioning and a critique and an opening that needs to happen within this realm, whether you're working, again, from communications, from leadership, from the creative industries, from the security space. There's a need for us to continue to have this conversation so that we can slowly continue to make the progress that we're making, that Callum described so well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eleanor. As I have the floor, I just want to make sure that you saw the message from our director, because as alumni, you are part of the global projects we have to redefine the Graduate Institute, to see how we want to go in the future. So please participate to this mural and speak about diversity, because this is the key word of the Institute of Tomorrow. So please be part of this. And for the students, I remember you that if you want to have connections with the alumni, there is 20,000 of them around the world. We have 40 chapters and 20 ambassadors. So keep in touch with us all the time. Alizé, all of you, thank you so much. Zani, I give you the floor. Thank you.
I think that's a wonderful conclusion from Karine. I just wanted to say thank you so much for everyone for attending, and the panelists. I think you were amazing. You were honest. It's so good to see people who have passions and that can take that into their careers. I think that inspires us to know that we can stay somehow idealistic, but take that actually into our jobs and have careers. So that's really good to know. I want to thank you a lot, and I know everyone who's attending will say the same. So thank you. This will be available later for those who can join. Thank you, Alizé. Have a wonderful night, everyone. Oh, and Karine wants to take a picture quickly. Yes. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye.